Welcome to the Pioneer Podcast. This is Adam Strydom. We have just returned from our advocacy tour in the United States, where we spent some time in Washington, D.C. and New York. I don't want to say too much about that now because, firstly, we have already published some content on this on YouTube, on my own YouTube channel, and also the YouTube channel of my colleague from AfriForum, Ernst van Zyl, or Conscious Caracal as he is known on social media. And we have also published 2 episodes on this podcast. One where I speak with Colonel Chris Wyatt about the Trump assassination attempt, and also a conversation with Ernst van Zyl about Afrikaners and the Western world. There are also some episodes lined up with some people whom we interviewed during this trip, and I don't want to spoil too much about that now, other than to say that I'm quite excited about these episodes, which will be published soon. Now, I can give you a very short overview of the trip, and not so much the trip itself, but what you can see about the trip we had. One is that I spoke at the NatCon conference in Washington, D.C. That's NatCon 4. NatCon, of course, stands for National Conservatism. And so the speech that I gave at this conference is available on YouTube on the NatCon, the National Conservatism YouTube channel. Secondly, I was interviewed by Jack Posobiec on his show on human events, and I was given the interview by Jack's team. I also spent some time with Jack. He's a great guy and a good friend of ours. And that interview can be seen on my YouTube channel. And then thirdly, we had an incredible event in New York City hosted by the New York Young Republicans, also with Jack Posobiec and Rahim Kassam. A fantastic event, and I want to thank the New York Young Republicans for hosting this event. So as I'm recording this, I've just received a video of the speech that I made at this event. And so by the time this interview is published, I'm pretty sure that you would be able to watch it either on the YouTube channel of the New York Young Republicans or on my own. And if you are uncertain about this, you can just check social media and you would find links to this speech. Now, before we get to today's interview, I want to share some comments about this podcast. This is still a new podcast. This would be the 5th episode in our series. And I would encourage you to go and listen to the other episodes if you haven't done so yet. And the point of this podcast is to discuss issues relating to South Africa, to the Afrikaner people, and to the West, and our activities and adventures, you might say, to garner support for the work that we are doing in South Africa through the Solidarity Movement and the list of institutions that form part of this movement. So in the weeks and months ahead, we will publish a lot of content on the different institutions in the Solidarity Movement and the work that we are doing, and also interviews with our friends abroad about issues relating to the West and the conservative idea. And the reason why we place such emphasis on the conservative idea and why it's important for us to speak at conferences like NatCon and CPAC is because when we say conservative, we mean a recognition of the importance of protecting the things that we have inherited from our ancestors, also one day to hand these things over to our descendants. Now, I have to say, we were quite surprised and excited about the list of countries from where people are listening to this podcast. As I said, we are still fairly new, but it seems that we do have quite some reach already. And so, according to the latest information available, we have listeners in South Africa, the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, Germany, the Netherlands, Sweden, Ireland, New Zealand, Spain, Argentina, Côte d'Ivoire, or Ivory Coast, Indonesia, Portugal, Turkey, Russia, Canada, the Philippines, Namibia, Hong Kong, Georgia, Japan, Mexico, Malaysia, Poland, and Eswatini, or Swaziland. And so we'd like to hear from you. I do know, of course, that It's difficult to measure such things because of VPN, but I would encourage you, especially if you do not live in South Africa, to send us some feedback, to tell us where you are listening to this podcast from, and also provide some feedback about the podcast and what you would like to hear on this podcast. So you can send us an email to info@afrikaner.org, and we would be very happy to look at your input and to see where our listeners are and why you are listening to this podcast. Also, I should emphasize that the point of the Afrikaner Foundation, the newly established institution in the Solidarity Movement, and also this podcast, which is one of the communication platforms of the Afrikaner Foundation, is to garner support for the work that we are doing. And this includes institutional cooperation. It includes, to an extent at least, policy influence with regard to South Africa. But it also includes fundraising. If you're listening to this podcast and you support the work that we are doing, I would encourage you to go to our website, afrikaner.org, /support, and support the Afrikaner Foundation by making a donation or a monthly contribution, signing up as a member and making a small monthly contribution. Now, I mentioned in the speech in New York that if you buy 2 cappuccinos at Starbucks in America, that's more or less the equivalent of going to a restaurant in South Africa and buying a high-quality steak meal because of purchasing power parity. So if you are willing to provide a donation in dollars or pounds or euros, it would be a small donation to you, but it would be a big donation to us. And through these donations, we can strengthen the Afrikaner Foundation in our work, in our contribution and our participation in the international conversation, but we can also strengthen our fundraising activities to do fundraising for the many projects that we are involved with currently. And one of these projects, of course, is Orania and the work that we are doing to support the development of Orania, which is why I spoke with Joost Strydom, who is the CEO of the Orania Movement. Orania is a cultural community in the Northern Cape with a particular focus on the Afrikaner people. Orania has aspirations to become a city and to play an important role as far as growing self-determination for the Afrikaner people is concerned. But Orania has also been targeted by the most bizarre press coverage you can imagine. Not so much from local media, from South African media, but especially from international media. And so if you only listen to what some journalists in America, England, the Netherlands, Germany, and some other Western countries especially have to say about Orania, you would get a completely distorted idea of what is actually happening in Orania. Some of this is just poor journalism, but unfortunately some of it is grotesquely dishonest and unethical journalism. And so there have been stories of black journalists who have claimed that Orania somehow made an exception for them by letting them in and that they can give you the inside scoop about what is happening in Orania, when any black person is welcome to go to Orania. There have been some news reports creating the perception that Orania is this big walled-off community with gates and you need to get special permission for them to open the gates for you to come in, when anyone who has been to Orania would know that this is just nonsense. Then there was also an incident of a journalist who happened to be black, who was in Orania doing a story, and then one Sunday he went to one of the churches as the people in church were busy with a sermon. So he went inside with his film team and they started filming the people as they were singing hymns and praying and so forth. And one of the elders of the church told this person that it's not quite appropriate to do this and asked them to wait outside for the people to finish, whereafter they could interview whoever they wanted. This journalist then wrote a story claiming that he was kicked out of the church because he was black. But I have to say that the most unethical news reports I have seen about Orania was from white European journalists. And there have been some really bizarre and atrocious stories of journalists, for example, and quite recently doing a story in Orania and then going to one of the parks and without the permission of the parents, starting to interview young children playing in the park, asking them extremely politically loaded questions. For example, about apartheid and Nelson Mandela and so forth. And then if you were to tell them that they should not be doing this, in some cases you get the response that Orania is somehow trying to hide something, when it's just basic decency that you don't interview young children without the permission of their parents. And even when you do, you don't exploit children by asking them such questions. And there are many such stories about Orania, and I don't want to provide you with all of them today because I want to get to our interview. But I could say that despite all of this, Orania keeps growing. It keeps growing in terms of its population with about 12% population growth per year. It keeps growing the economy, and Orania is increasingly taken seriously by people in South Africa, by the South African government, and also by role players abroad. And these are just some of the things that I discussed in my conversation with Joost Strydom. Joost Strydom, thank you very much. Welcome to the podcast, and thank you for speaking with me about Orania and what is happening in Orania. So I was thinking perhaps a good way to start this discussion is with two short stories or references. The one is a statue or a memorial that was erected in Budapest about 10 years ago or something like that. It's a memorial about the German occupation of Hungary. And some people describe it as the anti-Nazi memorial. It's a memorial to remember the history of Hungary during the Second World War and the danger of fascism to the Hungarian ideal or dream. And the memorial is quite beautiful in the sense that there's a woman, almost angelic, depicted as an angel that represents Hungary, holding an orb, and the orb represents the Hungarian freedom ideal, and then there's this warped, distorted eagle flying in, trying to snatch the orb, which represents fascism. And so it's very clear what the monument represents. And the strange thing about this monument was that, is that a lot of people are angry about this monument. They're not angry about the fact that the monument repudiates or rejects Nazism. They're angry about the fact that they don't want the Hungarians to reject Nazism because they want to believe that the Hungarians are Nazis. And so instead of celebrating the fact that the Hungarians reject Nazism, they actually protest the monument, saying that you should not reject Nazism because you are Nazis, something along those lines. And the other story also relates to Budapest. I was recently I recently spoke at CPAC in Budapest, and the great thing about being a speaker at a conference like this is you get the opportunity to meet the other speakers and so forth. And so one of the things that really struck me is, firstly, how many people at this conference know about South Africa and know about the Afrikaners and what's happening. And it seemed to me that there are, broadly speaking, three things that these people know. When you come up, I'm not talking about the average person on the street, but people who are more politically inclined. They know about farm attacks in South Africa, and they know about load shedding, and they know about Orania. But as far as Orania goes, there are a lot of questions. People don't always know what exactly do we make of Orania, how should we interpret this. And one thing that two people said to me at 2 different occasions, that really struck me was that they've only read negative publicity about Orania, but that they are still positive about Orania because they know they know the publishers who publish these negative reviews. So I'd love to hear your views on that. Does this resonate with you in the way Orania is depicted abroad?
Yeah, Ernst, what an intro from Nazism to journalism. But I think the metaphor in which Orania stands, which is Orania is a freedom project, and I think one of the most important, or one of the most defining things that happens in the media, in terms of trying to understand Orania, trying to make something of Orania, definitely is to use Orania, and I think that happens on both sides of the political spectrum, to be honest, to use Orania as a confirmation of biases or things that people already believe. And in the case of the media, they have a certain sentiment in regards to South Africa, in regards to Afrikaners, in regards to organizations or movements that call themselves, freedom movements in general, and specifically in regards to right-wing conservative movements around the world, also looking at Orania, and media institutions and journalists has been here explicitly stated that Orania's influence on other conservative movements around the world is something that is of concern to them. I think one of the clear indicators of that was with the recent broadcast of Channel 4, in which they stated, these mysterious donors from Trump's campaign or from European conservative politics that contributes to Orania. Obviously it's a small project that some of our international friends helped us here, but they make it sound like these like an underground mysterious movement of right-wing or conservative organizations around the world working together in this kind of conspiracy. So I think Orania is being used to create a narrative, which is the narrative that these journalists want to show the world or want people to believe or whatever. So one of my experiences throughout was that media that come to Orania obviously already have a certain perspective in their minds, in the way that they want to project the article. Maybe the content wasn't written or shot yet, but the idea is already formed. So you have very little opportunity to state what you really are, what you really believe, and having some of the more difficult conversations in regards to things like labor in Orania, which is something that I think is both in terms of our labor policy in Orania, something to protect Afrikaners, to give Afrikaners opportunity to create demographic realities, but also it's a reformative thing. No one can say that we exploit anyone else in terms of our labor. And that's something that is a complicated conversation, and to get media institutions to understand that really is honestly our goal, as you use the metaphors of that Hungarian statue, to really get journalists to understand that we are honest when we say we are not exploiting anyone. Obviously, we also create demographic realities and things like that, but we are honest. I think it's hard to convince people that we actually mean what we say.
I wanna let's go to the labor thing first, and I want to ask some broader questions. But since you mentioned labor now, so Herman Gilumir, the historian, has written that one of the reasons why the apartheid system failed, or the white minority government, regardless of moral questions and so forth, was that the labor policy was just not sustainable, in the sense that you had these different homelands for different peoples, and there were areas for different black tribes where they could live, and then there were the so-called white areas, but the Afrikaners or the white areas was largely dependent on black labor. And so Orania is taking a different approach on this, saying that you use the Afrikaans word volkseie arbeid, to use our own labor. And so this sort of puts Orania in a predicament, in the sense that it's almost a lose-lose. If you don't use volkseie arbeid, then you are exploiting people on the basis of race. If you use volkseie arbeid, then you are excluding people on the basis of race. So just give the listener an overview of what is the labor policy of Orania, and why is this such an important thing that you had to mention it in your first answer already?
I think it's so important because it is the fundamental idea of Orania. You cannot have a freedom organization that isn't consequent throughout in its entire philosophy or approach in regards to the freedom that you say you strive towards. So on the one hand, it's easy to say, well, we want political independence, or we want more tax independence, or we want this, or we want, we have different freedom ideals, but you have to be, and that's one of the main issues with many minority or freedom organizations around the world. They are not consistent in their beliefs throughout, from personal and family values to labor and economic realities to political thought and so on. So Orania basically already, the founding fathers or the original thinkers were academics, and they realized this labor thing very, very early on. And they said, some of the first conferences in this regard was in the 1950s. It was long before the height of apartheid. These thinkers and think tanks, Sabra specifically, had conferences in regards to agriculture and labor, saying that there's a very specific trajectory that's happening in South Africa. And the listeners who do not understand South Africa that well, or do not know the reality on the ground in South Africa that well, might find this difficult to believe, or to have a clear indication of what's really going on. But the relationship between mining, forestry, agriculture, things that are labor intensive, and the industrialization of South Africa got so intense that development got so dependent on cheap black labor in South Africa, and that reality grew and grew and grew and grew into the art of apartheid. And these thinkers stated, well, this is going to become a very big problem. Afrikaners are going to become such a minority that they will have no say in anything in regards to themselves. Being the very same people who a few years ago fought for recognition and rights as a minority against the English, they understood that sooner or later some of the cultural groups in South Africa is going to demand that same groups. And we saw that into the 60s, 70s and 80s with a lot of unrest and things like that. But the reality on the ground is that, back to where I started, that no freedom organization can state politically one thing and then practically or economically do another thing. So the reality of doing your own work creates, I think, two, but maybe three things. First of all, it is a reformative thing. No one gets exploited for your freedom goals. And no one can claim that what you achieved or what you built was done by exploitation or by misuse or anything like that. Secondly, you create a demographic reality. To make any political decisions, and political decisions is the ability to think and decide something and then execute on it. To make any political decisions in your own best interest, you have to be a majority. Otherwise, and we're going to see some of this happening, I think, in Europe and in the US and so on, the people holding formal political power becoming a minority, whether that be in thought or demographics or whatever. But they still have that formal power, but the reality on the ground is just something different. So if you're not a majority in your own area, you do not have political power. You might have it still for 10 years or 20 years or whatever, clinging on to institutional power. But in real terms, in cultural terms, in cultural political terms, you will lose it. And South Africans, Afrikaners learned that in the past 50 years. So the second thing then is demographics. Being a majority in your own area is the only way to make decisions about your future. And thirdly, as a way to organize yourself culturally, we also see it in religious terms, being able to offer your labor as something with value into eternity, building things that are valuable into eternity. And it's maybe hard to see on the short term, building some, I almost want to say makeshift, some steel and wood houses here in the semi-desert arid areas of the Karoo, something that maybe doesn't look like it's built for hundreds of years or whatever. But but giving your labor, creating that reality on the ground, I think is something with value into eternity. So that's maybe the three reasons. Firstly, no one can accuse us of exploitation. Secondly, demographic realities. And thirdly, and very importantly, also the cultural and religious value of labor. And that is fundamental to the Orania idea. Without that, Orania is just in a state where we want certain people and don't want other people. Orania, a journalist once called Orania the antidote to apartheid. Now, that was maybe, from his perspective, something that he wanted to compliment us in having reformative thought. I think the reality is just Orania is a third option. Orania is not grabbing back to the past. Orania is also not embracing what is happening in South Africa at the moment with the way the ANC is ruling this country and so on. Orania is a third option outside of the parameters that is set in the larger political arena playground.
So you mentioned culture, and I want to get to that and then tie that up with some of the criticisms that Orania has been getting and get you to respond to that. Afrikaners are very communitarian or conservative, culturally conservative, in the sense that we value our communal identity, we value our culture and our tradition, and we want to preserve that. And in South Africa, we have many friends, especially in the English-speaking world in South Africa, who are more liberal, more individualist. And some of the criticisms I want to mention too that are in a way linked, and I'd like you to hear your comments on that. The one is from as Ronald Reagan said, a well-meaning liberal friend who remarked that if we are against social engineering, we have to be against the type of social engineering that Orania is engaged with as well, referring to the fact that you have to apply to be able to stay in Orania. You can't just come and start living in Orania. And the other was more recent, is a friend who works at a think tank who made some disparaging remarks about Orania. And I actually spoke with him about this afterwards. And I said, but explain to me your view on this. And the summary of his view is that the core of what Orania is involved with it's a race project. It's a project of including people based on race and excluding people based on race. Is this an accurate reflection? So how would you respond to this from an Orania perspective?
Once a journalist had a Orania lady, a conversation with a Orania lady, and that specific journalist was a very liberal, very antagonistic German reporter. She was very, as I said, antagonistic, attacking this lady over and over again. Set up cameras and everything in her house. This specific woman also had small boys. And, this journalist were grinding her inside of her own house and making it very difficult for her to explain why you live in Orania and so on and so on. You're a bunch of racists and white supremacists and I don't know what everything she called her. And what the kind of the conclusion, the final stage of this interview, she tried to bring it back to the age-old question that all journalists very unoriginally ask about Orania. And she asked, what would you do if one of your boys go off to university and come back with a black woman and he wants to marry her? What's your reaction going to be? That typical late question. And I think the way that this lady responded to it was brilliant, right? So to be honest, she didn't answer the question, but she had a good reaction to it that redefined it in Oranian terms. And she asked this German reporter, who obviously don't necessarily have a very good grip on the different groups in South Africa and so on. She asked, okay, counter question. This woman that my son has now met up with at university, who is she? Is she a Zulu? Is she a Xhosa? Is she a Pedi or Venda or so on? This journalist didn't know. Maybe she knew who Zulus were or whatnot, but she didn't know the different cultural groups in South Africa, and she didn't know how to respond to that. But the emphasis moved from race to culture. Orania is a cultural project. It is in no unclear means. It is also a collectivist project. We are a community. Afrikaans word for that is a volk. I don't think nation actually describes that very well. But we are a group of people. We are a definable group of people. One of the three things that you strive towards in dreams of more freedom is a definable people. We are that. If you are in very liberal terms only orientated towards economic realities and a lot of people who want to call Orania out for having a specific defined group, they are also social engineered, but just into individualist economic choice. The kind of this very classic liberal or libertarian thought of the individual in the arena of the economic world and individual economic choice and so on. And that is not our primary way of thinking. We are a collectivist group, that is no doubt about it. So if you are collectivist, who are you? Well, it's always strange to me that people who want to accuse us of the things that's happening in the apartheid years or want reparations for that, they can really say who the guilty party is. They can define us very well in those terms. The people who want to take land and repossess it from the government side, they can very clearly state who's guilty, who must lose the land and who must get the land. But anyone else thinking from the other side has no right to define who we are. That's kind of the hypocrisy of that. So other groups can define us, but the moment we do it ourselves, we are racists or we are a racial project or whatever. Orania is a cultural project, Afrikaners, and Afrikaner history is very well documented by different authors, including Herman Guillemets, which brilliantly did it from a kind of objective perspective, I think. And we are a group that came from different European nations. We are a Western group. We stand in the Western tradition of law and of many things, including our philosophies and our cultures and so on. And the other groups who are in South Africa also came from somewhere. No one magically appeared here. And that's kind of our philosophy in regards to that. So our right to residency program is very specifically to keep Orania an Afrikaner cultural project. We are no means unclear or hypocritical or trying to hide it, that we believe we are a specific group of people, that we believe the right to residency in Orania is dependent on being part of this culture. But our focus was always culture. Nowhere in any of our founding documents, any of our right to residency documents, we say, well, we're going to test your race with some obscure tests, So applying to live in Orania, we look at the physical risk of a newcomer. Is he a criminal, a murderer, a rapist, a criminal on a fugitive? And secondly, is he a cultural risk? Our goal is to have our institutions in Afrikaans, to be Christian, to celebrate holidays that's important to us, including major battles and major wars and religious holidays and things like that, in contrast to the South African set of public holidays. Are you going to be an asset and help build that out? Or are you something that opposes our values, our Christianity, our culture? And it's a multi-layered, multi-level thing. It is really ignorant to be so shallow to focus only on the color of our skin. I don't want to call that a coincidence, but it is. There's so many realities that make you an Afrikaner. It's so many layers. So if people look from an outside perspective and they only see one thing, well, then I say you are still in the thought process of apartheid. I've never looked at Xhosa or Zulu person and think, well, the only thing that you are is black. Well, there's stark cultural differences between us as well. But defining people only in terms of one thing that they are, it's shallow. I mean, it's almost dishonestly shallow. To say that Afrikaners and Englishmen or Polish people or Americans are exactly the same because they are white, that is apartheid level thinking. There are clear differences, and we see it here also with many groups of people who are maybe white but not Afrikaners, who wants to come and live here but not necessarily fit in 100%, because to embrace our culture is a process of the way that you're raised, the way that you are socialized, and so on and so on. So my short response would just be to say that's very shallow, to see it only that, and it's to misunderstand Orania and to act like Orania kind of wants to be collectivist under the rug. We are not. We are clearly so. We are culturally very clearly a collectivist or a communitarian project.
We've spoken and on other platforms, you and I both, about the problem of double standards in South Africa. But it's also this strange thing where I've never heard someone look at Mnyameni or Nkandla or whichever traditional community, Tabanchu, and say it's a black enclave or it's a blacks only community. when it's very clearly a community that has a particular cultural focus. But when there's a white, in quotation marks, community, or an Afrikaner community where the people who live there happen to be white, and it's a cultural project, then the accusation is that it's a whites-only community. So I want to hear your thoughts on that. Why do you think this double standards exist? And maybe if I can sort of push two questions into one. And the other thing was, and I know you've been asked this many times, but would it then be possible for a black person to say, but I am an Afrikaner, I want to live in Orania? Are there black Afrikaners, and can they come and stay in Orania?
As to answer your first question, I think there's only one reason why that happens, and that's arrogance, a kind of imperial arrogance, to say, yeah, you know, those black communities, they are so traditional, they live 100 years behind us, and maybe the people don't explicitly state that, but it is in the back of their minds. It's fine when they do it. It's an imperialist way of thinking to say those people are still primitive. They don't necessarily form those words or consciously form those thoughts, but they think it's acceptable because they're just so far behind. And I see that sentiment with journalists and with liberal thinkers as well. They don't state it, but they do believe it. So it's fine when those guys do it. You know, it's kind of this anthropological thought of the 1850s to the 1940s or whatever.
We have lower expectations.
But these Afrikaners, they're supposed to be modern, you know, and live in a metropolitan, multicultural environment because that's the modern thing to do. I honestly believe it's an arrogant way of thinking. We choose to live in the reality that we create. Now, for the second question, I think that's a question that we get a lot. And I think maybe there's a theoretical, what I'm going to answer is I'm going to answer from an Orania point of view in terms of our right to residency and so on. First of all, anyone is welcome to apply to come and live here, as well as the fact that that every individual case is treated by a panel of peers. That means people from the street, everyday Oranians that have an interview with newcomers. So anyone is welcome to go through that process. And as I said, nowhere is race mentioned anyway. We don't have a test to see if your DNA is of a certain. But then I also want to answer it from another point of view. I don't believe Johnny Clegg was ever a Zulu. I think in an age where anyone can try to identify as anything, in an age where everything is fluid, Orania is not taking that standpoint, that things are just fluid. I've met many people who are very influenced by Afrikaner culture, Zulu people or Xhosa people, who went through a schooling, Afrikaans schooling, maybe got adopted by Afrikaner parents or things like that. I'm not convinced that makes you an Afrikaner. I don't think that necessarily that just flips you over. I don't think a person who just wants to come and live in Orania for certain of Orania started very pioneerish and tough and so on. And then the line for people who wanted to identify as Afrikaners were much shorter. So on the one hand, theoretically, anyone can apply, and I think it's in the community's hand at the end of the day, in very practical terms, who could come and live here. No one's been tested for their race ever in Orania. And finally, I want to state from my side, I think the fluid kind of switch over between cultures and things like that is just not something that I've personally really saw. An interviewer once asked the Orania spokesperson, at the end of her kind of antagonistic interview, he said, listen, okay, so it was a black man who was conducting the interview, and he said, well, that's all very nice. Can I come and live there? And the guy responded, yes. And he said, are you serious? The interviewer asked. He said, well, I'm just as serious as you are. So I think that was a brilliant way to answer that question, because while the application process is open, I've sent the ANC secretary in the Northern Cape once made a lot of noise that he's going to buy a house in Orania and show people that this project cannot continue and so on. And we responded by sending him application papers. And then in a radio interview after that, he stated, well, me as I think a Xhosa man or whatever, so and so. And I said, well, so you're saying you're not an Afrikaner? That's what you're saying. You just said, well, I speak Afrikaans and so on, so on, so on, but you just stated now I'm a Xhosa man. So it can be a long debate or a long conversation, Ernst. People are welcome to apply to come and live here. I think culture is not something that lets people grab it and manipulate it as they see fit, specifically for political goals. There's a theoretical answer, and then there's a practical answer. And I want to conclude with, well, we're just as serious as you were.
So I think it would be important to point out that there's a difference between the Afrikaner community and the Afrikaans-speaking community.
Absolutely.
And so some people would say, well, there are many colored people who are Afrikaners. I've never met a colored person who defines himself as an Afrikaner, but they would be Afrikaans-speaking, because to be an Afrikaner is to be part of a particular cultural community. We used to be known as the Boers, or still are to an extent.
Can I come in for there for a second? Because it's very important, because it's one of the points that confuse people so much. They say, well, what about a black Afrikaner or a brown Afrikaner and so on? And I want to know who exactly that is, because they refer just back to one thing, and that's language. Language doesn't make up the group. Just because a person speaks English doesn't make him an American or whatever. But there are a group of people in South Africa, brown people who speak Afrikaans and maybe even are Christians, or are Christians, but that doesn't make them Afrikaners, and they don't define themselves in those terms. And to come back to that stupid metaphor that I used, if people are getting punished for apartheid, will those people be included into that? If there are land reform, would their land be taken away just because they speak Afrikaans? So what exactly is the definition? It's yet again very shallow to just look at language.
I want to get to this cooperation agreement, because even though Orania is getting a lot of criticism from abroad and the media, there seems to be a fair level of recognition for Orania and what Orania is engaged with by the South African government. There's not, and correct me if I'm wrong, but there's not an antagonistic relationship between Orania and the South African government. In fact, it seems to be the opposite. Looking at Vali Musa's comments in Parliament several years ago, the more recent comments by a South African representative at the United Nations, and now this new cooperation agreement that's in the news. So would you give us an overview of this?
Yes, and definitely, because it's something that I also feel very passionate about. And that is the fact that Orania, as a small town, grabs a lot of international attention, and also even on government level in South Africa. So the Orania process of thought started in the 80s and 90s with the so-called Volksstaatsraad. They organized a lot of meetings with government, in which Thabo Mbeki famously told Constant Viljoen and Karel Boshoff and others that were involved. He gave them a tip in a lesson in Volksstaat politics, and he told them, if I were you, I would create a reality on the ground that no one can deny. And that's kind of been our Oranian philosophy from there, saying create realities and get confirmation or recognition for that later.
He said, show us the animal.
Show us the animal. Yeah.
What is this thing? We talk about ideas, but where is it? What does it look like?
Exactly. A lot of people draw maps on social media. This is going to be the Afrikaner independent area or whatever. Yeah. There's nothing without creating realities, and that takes years. And later on, in that process of negotiations and so on, the Article 235 of the South African Constitution, which grants the right to cultural independence or self-sufficiency, and later on then Vali Musa, Minister of Constitutional Development, said in Parliament, well, the suit for Afrikaner cultural, for Afrikaner area and the Northwest Corridor is a legitimate pursuit, kind of confirming that. And from then, in 2000, Orania had a court case about our municipal status, in which we settled with the state that Orania gets recognized on a very basic level. We've built onto that, and 2 or 3 years ago got further confirmation, and now this agreement is on the table. And also that at the United Nations battle for racial discrimination and so on. What's it?
It was the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination.
And the South African representative replied to kind of the UN's representatives, stating that Orania is not a legal project and so on. They said, well, Orania is legal in their eyes. There's nothing wrong. It's a community and so on and so on. And then finally, and the freshest news is the FF Plus having a provincial level agreement with the ANC about the provincial legislature, and in that included recognition for Orania. That recognition is kind of a recognition of all this build-up that I referred to now. So Orania always tried to, we're very clear about what we are and what our ideals are and so on, but we always try to keep a good relationship. And I think many Oranians already understand that in terms of one nation, one country, one state negotiating with another state. And maybe a bit ambitious, but you have to be ambitious and maybe a bit mad to have a project like Orania. So we see it as negotiations with another state, with another government, and that is in effect what this is. Even if very small, it is Orania's government, which is a local government, negotiating with the provincial government, which is a provincial government. There's a government-to-government negotiation about the status of our community, including a lot of very positive things that is not defined so far that we don't have breathing space, but it's things like being a special economic zone, being an Afrikaner cultural zone. Interestingly, that the ANC government recognizes Orania as a cultural zone, whereas liberal thinkers in South Africa cannot understand that. So the people who are supposed to be our biggest opponents understand that there's something like culture and that we want a area for Afrikaner culture, but liberal thinkers on the other side of the spectrum almost doesn't even grant us that recognition. They reduce us to something less than that. But the government is willing to understand that. And we know that this agreement is circulated to national level, to the National Executive Committee of the ANC, where it was looked over by lawyers and whatnot. And it doesn't seem to be a problem. And at the stage of the recording of this, we are still to sign it, but it's already widely discussed. It's already actually agreed upon. The FF Plus, they give they counter that demand on their side by giving the ANC certain things on provincial level, and we get the advantages on Orania level. So by the time of this recording hasn't been signed yet, but we trust it will happen quite soon, and the content was widely discussed, and we hope to see that agreement going to as a landmark thing in Orania's history, a recognition that we've never had formally before, including remarks about Article 235, which I referred to, including the Wali-Musa Declaration, including the 2000 court case, including words like special economic zone and a special cultural zone and things like that.
So maybe a last question then would be just about the way forward for Orania. Orania has about 2,000 to 3,000 people, but Orania often talks about becoming a city, developing into a fully fledged city. Is that not too ambitious or unrealistic? How would you describe the, let's say, medium to long-term goals of Orania?
That's not ambitious enough, but it is an important marker. In the conservative momentum of the late 1980s, when Orania then started, the founders thought that 100,000 Afrikaners would immigrate here, and immigrate in quotation marks, and move here, and this reality will just start. And they asked Professor Karel Boshoff, which was one of the founders, shortly before his death, what is your greatest disappointment about this project? He said, well, the people didn't come. We believed we're going to create this reality, but the people did not show up. Afrikaners did not come. One of the reasons was people just happily integrated into the Rainbow Nation. People didn't want to do own labor. No one wanted to move to the desert and start something here. And then the next question was, what are you the proudest of? I said, well, we started. We did start something. We started this ideal, this freedom ideal. And even if it's just a small seed, it will grow. So we had to temper down our ambitions a bit in the early 2000s because Afrikaners didn't come in the amounts that we believed them to come. But things are changing, and Orania has been growing rapidly, yearly growth of between 12 and 15% for the past 5-6 years. It doubled its population twice in the past 10 years. And so it has been growing, and we understand that a lot of Afrikaners is caught in economic realities in the rest of the country. They simply cannot move. They don't have the means. So to to medium-term goal is to create a city. We can have an entire podcast about that, but to move from a rural town to kind of a rural city, keeping this Afrikaner cultural feeling of being rural, but having the sophisticated economic systems, specialization and so on that one would look for in a city. We already, remember, we still pay tax to the South African government while funding local projects ourselves and with our allies and our friends. So it's a challenge to build big infrastructure like big sewage works, our solar farm, things like that with our own funds.
Without tax money.
Without maybe in the next agreement we can keep some of our tax money as well. But it's tough to do that. So what we have to do is what we are doing is to create infrastructure which can house 10,000 Afrikaners. That would be an important marker for us, to get people both to physically live here, to support them with basic infrastructure, and to orientate them towards the Orania dream, the Orania way of thinking. I think Orania culture is developing as well. So that would be a next marker. And then to dominate our area demographically, this is the lowest populated part of the country. And it was chosen as such because we want to use this demographic hole, this empty demographic space, to give Afrikaners a place where we can be the majority. And that, in its different possibilities, is maybe the long-term goal. Freedom requires demographic realities. And the short term, our next goal is to grow from town to city, and then maybe a bigger city, and then to start dominating our area, creating a space, a homeland for Afrikaners, which is something that we haven't had for a very, very long time.
Joost Strydom, thank you very much. We certainly need to go into this topic of building the city, but as you say, that's a topic for another episode maybe, and I think a lot of our listeners would be very interested in that. But thank you for your perspective.
Thank you, Ernst. As I said, we can speak for hours. This is such an exciting project, and I hope our international friends share to an extent in our excitement and our dreams.
Thank you.